Today we talk about something humans have been trying to control since the beginning of time. How to have a boy or a girl.
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
People often think sex selection is some new modern technology, but the truth is, humans have been trying to influence the sex of their children for thousands of years. Different cultures have strong preferences for boys or girls for many different reasons. And in some societies, the son carries on the family name. Sometimes they get property because they're a boy. In other families, today it's much simpler. Sometimes parents just have a lot of boys and they want a girl. So as you would expect, what did people do? They tried to figure out a way to influence the outcome. And over centuries, people had some pretty creative ideas. Some believed the moon phase determined the sex of the baby. Others believed certain foods could influence it. There were even instructions about the time of day you should have intercourse. But the most famous myth probably came from a physician in 1960 named Dr. Landrum Shettles. Dr. Shettles created what became known as the Shettles Method, which is still discussed today on the internet. The idea was based on the belief that male sperm and female sperm behave differently. According to the theory, if you wanted a boy, you should have intercourse right after ovulation. You wanted to use deep penetration positions such as the doggy style, and the woman should ideally have an orgasm. And the reason was the male sperm were faster but were more fragile. So if they had shorter distance to travel and the timing was perfect, they would reach the egg first. On the other hand, if you wanted a girl, the instructions were the opposite. You should have intercourse 2 or 3 days before ovulation. You should use shallower penetration positions such as missionary, and you would avoid female orgasm. And the idea here was that if the females were supposedly slower but stronger, they could survive longer waiting for the egg. Now, in theory, this sounds pretty logical on the surface, but there's just one really big problem. It's completely not true. Studies have repeatedly shown that X and Y sperm swim essentially the same speed. There is no reliable evidence that position, orgasm, timing, or any of those factors meaningfully influence the sex of the baby. And the reason becomes obvious when you understand the biology. Men have X and Y chromosomes. When sperm are made, these chromosomes split during meiosis, and that produces an X chromosome and the Y chromosome sperm. And this process is incredibly balanced. Men produce equally the number of X and Y sperm. So that means when conception happens, there is basically a 50-50 chance. So then the question comes up, well, if it's 50-50, tell me then, how do some families have 5 boys in a row or 5 girls in a row? Well, if you listen to any of my other podcasts, you know the answer is statistics. We talked about imagine flipping a coin 5 times and getting 5 heads. That's not very unusual. It's not impossible. It's because the sample size is small. But if you flip that quarter 100 times, you would expect results closer to 50-50. And that's the same thing that happens with families. If you had 100 kids, you probably would have 50 girls and 50 boys. But that's not really possible. But here's one very interesting thing between X and Y sperm. And this difference is incredibly tiny. The X chromosome is larger than the Y chromosome. So sperm carrying an X chromosome contains slightly more DNA. Matter of fact, the difference is almost 3%. It's 2.8% more genetic material. Now, in absolute terms, that means it equals about 0.084 picograms of DNA. Now, a picogram is so tiny, it's hard for us to even understand it. So let's make it a little simpler. We all understand days, hours, and years. So if 1 picogram equaled 1 second, then 1 gram would be equal to 32,000 years. That's how tiny a picogram is. And the difference between the two, X and Y, is 0.084 picograms. So as you can see, it's incredibly small. To give you an idea of the weight of an embryo, it's about 3,000 picograms. That means the difference between X and Y sperm is roughly 30 to 40,000 times lighter than the weight of an embryo. So as you can imagine, that's a very hard difference to detect, which leads us to the obvious question. If there is a difference in mass, can we separate them? Well, guess what? Scientists have tried. There's one technique called flow cytometry. The idea? Stain the sperm with a fluorescent dye that attaches to the DNA. Then, because X sperm contains slightly more DNA, they glow a little bit brighter under a laser, so then the machine will attempt to sort the sperm based on that brightness, where the X would have brighter and the Y's will be less bright. In theory, it sounds amazing, but in reality, it doesn't work very well. The difference between X and Y is so incredibly small that separating them reliably is extremely difficult. At best, some studies suggest it might be slightly better than chance and enrich one population of sperm over another, but it's nowhere near accuracy to depend on clinically. And because the process can stress or damage the sperm, it never became a standard fertility treatment. So despite decades of research, sperm sorting never became the solution people hoped for, which leaves us with the only method that actually works today. This process is PGT-A, which stands for pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploid. This means that the only reliable way to determine the sex of the baby before pregnancy is through IVF with genetic testing. During IVF, we retrieve the eggs from the ovaries and then we fertilize them in the laboratory. The embryos then grow for about 5 days until they reach the blastocyst stage. At that point, a few cells can be removed from the outer layer of the embryo, which is the placenta, and sent for testing. That testing is PGT-A, and the purpose of it is to make sure the embryos are chromosomally normal, that they don't have things like Down syndrome. But when we analyze the chromosomes, we also get to see the sex chromosomes. So we can determine whether the embryo is a girl or a boy. And this makes sex selection extremely accurate. In fact, it's almost 100%, but it is not 100%. As you can imagine, there is no test that is perfect, and there are discrepancies. So most places will say around 98 to 99% accurate. But as you can imagine, once we start talking about selecting embryos, ethical questions start to come up. Probably one of the most common things I hear from patients is, aren't we playing God? That's a very interesting question, because some of the people who are worried about playing God with IVF have no problem trying mythical methods like timing intercourse or certain positions. And if both approaches could potentially affect the outcome, why does one feel morally different than the other? It's not like God's sitting back going, okay, I was totally fine with the whole doggy style on this day, but unfortunately, I saw you actually use a method that's better, and now I'm upset. No, because they both were doing the same thing. Is for some reason, people have an issue when technology is involved. Now, that's not the only reason why people are worried. Others do worry about other broader consequences to society. For example, if large numbers of people strongly prefer one gender over the other, it could create population imbalances. And in fact, we've seen this happen in some parts of the world, which is why laws about sex selection vary dramatically depending on where you live. Matter of fact, we see many people from all over the world because in their country, they cannot have sex selection. Now, if you're listening to this in the United States, good for you. Sex selection is legal. Many clinics offer it, and usually it goes under the name family balancing, where parents already have children of one sex and one another. But in many countries, the rules are very different. In India or China, sex selection is strictly banned due to historical gender imbalances. In much of Europe, sex selection is only allowed if it is presenting a genetic disease linked to a specific sex, like hemophilia. Even our closest neighbor, Canada, restricts non-medical sex selection, just like Australia. And because of that, because of these restrictions, there is what's called fertility tourism. As I mentioned, people come to other countries to have a child. And it's important for us as clinics to not put information down that would allow it to be known that sex selection occurred. So what about the future? I mean, IVF PGT works, but it's expensive and it's invasive. And so scientists are constantly searching for easier methods. One of those methods is using spent media by looking at the fluid around the embryo culturing and seeing if some of the DNA cells released into the media can be analyzed without biopsying the embryo. Other methods that are being looked at is microfluidic sperm sorting. This is using special microscopic channels to separate the sperm with extreme precision. Now, we aren't there yet, but research is constantly going, and it's very active, and that's because it's very lucrative. The day we can determine a gender without any type of biopsy, without increasing the expense much, that is going to be a very lucrative treatment. Because just like for thousands of years, people want to pick the gender. Now, there have been other forms of sorting, such as using media and different densities, and it does have slight increase in one gender over the other. But this is only increasing it by 10, 20, maybe 30%. But to truly get the gender you want with accuracy, at this moment, the only method is IVF with PGTA. So in closing, when it comes to sex selection, here's the reality. For the thousands of years where humans have tried to influence whether they have a boy or a girl, most of the methods don't work. Foods, timing, position, they just don't work. The biology is extremely balanced. And the only method that reliably works today is IVF with genetic testing of the embryos. Now, you may not agree with it, but it is one of the advances we have in medicine at this time. And it wasn't always that way. When PGT came around, there was a lot of pushback about gender selection. I'll leave you with this last story if you're one of those patients who maybe thinks it's wrong. Because I don't completely disagree with you, but I do understand the reason for family balancing. But there was this one case I had where this doctor called me up and said to me, is there any way you can get them in and help them do IVF with PGTA? They didn't have a lot of money, and so he was asking if I could help them out. Now, why? Because they were on their 6th abortion, and the doctor said that they would get pregnant, and because they wanted a male, if it was a female, they would abort it. Now, I'm not saying every case is going to be like that, but as you can see, there is a need. And here, we were able to help them out so they could stop having these abortions. And to be honest, it made me feel good that, hey, at least I'm now helping them get this child they want and preventing any more of these unneeded abortions. And there's always going to be debate. And technology is always going to keep advancing. And whether you agree with it or not, the good news is there are options for people who want to, and there are options for people who do not want to. Hopefully today's episode helps separate the myth from science when it comes to sex selection. Maybe you're thinking about family balancing or we're just wondering about sex selection. And now maybe you have a little bit more information, or if you have a friend who's interested, let them know about this podcast. As always, I greatly appreciate everyone who writes in and tells me about topics that they're interested in. And if you like us, please give us a 5-star review on your favorite medium. Tell your friends about us, but most of all, keep coming back. I look forward to talking to you again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.